This is the story of the USS Squalus and of 33 men trapped in their sunken submarine at the fearful depth of 240 feet below the surface.
Submarines were once called the coffin service, and in 1939, that name nearly became prophecy. On what should have been a routine test dive, the USS Squalus suddenly plunged to the bottom of the Atlantic with 56 men aboard. Half the crew drowned instantly, while 33 survivors remained trapped in darkness, 240 feet below the surface. How did a submarine designed to be the Navy's safest end up fighting for survival at the bottom of the ocean? The coffin service. By the 1930s, submarines had already carved out a place in modern naval warfare, but they had done so at a terrible cost. In the years between World War I and World War II, over 800 sailors from 18 submarines across multiple nations had perished in accidents. Some were caused by faulty designs, others by human error, and a few simply by the merciless pressure of the sea. The public saw these disasters with grim fascination, and newspapers began to describe submariners as men who volunteered for death. It was not a glamorous branch of the military, but one weighed down by its reputation as the coffin service. Inside the Navy, the perception was only slightly better. Submariners trained to the highest standards, yet every dive came with the awareness that even the smallest mechanical failure could become fatal. The pressure at just a few hundred feet was enough to crush steel and snap bulkheads like matchsticks. The Navy's engineers worked tirelessly to create safer designs, and by the late 1930s, new classes of submarines promised speed, durability, and innovations like lead-acid batteries built to resist battle damage. Among these was a vessel named Squalus, launched in 1938 as part of the new Sargo class. On paper, she was one of the most advanced submarines ever constructed. The Squalus could reach depths of 250 feet, cruise at 20 knots on the surface, and travel more than 11,000 miles on a single tank of fuel. Designed to cut off enemy shipping and escape detection by diving in less than a minute, she was the pride of American naval engineering. Her sister ship, the USS Sculpin, was equally advanced. Together, they represented the promise of a new kind of submarine fleet, one that could defend American interests in the Pacific against Japan's growing naval power. Yet, reputations do not change overnight. For every new innovation, there were still memories of the dead. Sailors whispered about the vessels lost without warning, and families still mourned husbands, fathers, and brothers who had never come home. The Squalus might have been cutting edge, but it carried into the sea the same legacy of risk that haunted every submarine. Even her crew knew it, though they trained with pride and discipline. In May of 1939, during what was supposed to be a routine test, the world would be reminded just how thin the line was between technological progress and human tragedy. How did a state-of-the-art submarine, equipped with every safeguard engineers could design, suddenly transform into a steel tomb at the bottom of the ocean? The morning of the dive. The morning of May 23, 1939, began like any other at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in New Hampshire. The USS Squalus was preparing for another in a series of routine test dives meant to prove her seaworthiness before official deployment. On board were 56 men, 53 sailors and officers, 2 civilian engineers, and 1 representative from General Motors, which had designed the vessel's advanced batteries. The crew was seasoned, disciplined, and confident. They had drilled for every scenario, simulated every emergency, and trusted in the new Sargo-class design. At the helm stood Lieutenant Oliver F. Naquin, a strict but respected officer who had earned a reputation for discipline. Submarines demanded it. In a steel tube where a single mistake could mean catastrophe, there was no margin for carelessness. Naquin's demeanor reflected that truth. He gave orders clearly, without hesitation and expected his crew to follow with precision. That morning, he supervised preparations from the control room as the submarine left the mouth of the Piscataqua River and headed toward the Isle of Shoals, just a few miles off the New Hampshire coast. The dive plan was simple: several submersions and resurfacings, testing the engines, batteries, and watertight seals. It was the kind of trial every new submarine faced. By 9 a.m., the horns sounded to indicate the imminent dive. The control board lit up in green, each light representing a closed valve or sealed compartment. Everything looked perfect. Naquin gave the final command: dive. The diesel engines shut down, vents were sealed, and the submarine began to slip beneath the waves. At first, it seemed like any other descent. The crew braced as the vessel angled downward. Then, within seconds, something felt wrong. A sailor shouted over the intercom. Water was pouring into the engine room. Shock rippled through the control room. According to the indicators, every vent was sealed. The board glowed green. But reality was different. One main air induction valve had malfunctioned and remained open, allowing the sea to roar in unchecked. Naquin's face hardened as he grasped the magnitude of the disaster. He immediately ordered the ballast tanks blown in an attempt to surface. For a moment, the Squalus lurched upward, buoyed by air. But the water rushed faster than the ballast could counteract. The submarine slowed, shuddered, then tilted nose down and began sinking like a stone. What decision do you make when you realize saving half the crew means condemning the other half to certain death? The decision no captain wants to make. Chaos erupted in the aft compartments as seawater thundered through the engine room. Men scrambled, slipping across wet steel, fighting to close valves and escape rising torrents. Within seconds, the compartment flooded chest high. Shouts filled the intercom as sailors reported uncontrollable leaks. Meanwhile, in the control room, Naquin faced the most harrowing choice of his career. The submarine was divided by watertight doors. If left open, the flood would sweep through, drowning everyone on board. If sealed, the control room could remain intact, but the men in the engine rooms would be trapped forever. Naquin knew the rule. A captain's duty was to save as many lives as possible. Humanity screamed for him to keep the doors open. Reason told him to shut them immediately. He gave the order: seal the compartments. Chief Machinist's mate Lloyd Mann was among those who obeyed. He braced his shoulders against a 200-pound steel door, straining to close it, as water surged closer. Behind him, shipmates screamed, begging for more time. Some managed to dive through just before the door slammed shut. Others were not so lucky. The wheel spun, the bolts locked, and the fate of 17 men in the aft sections was sealed. Among them was Sherman Shirley, Lloyd Mann's closest friend. The two had known each other for years, and Shirley was days away from his wedding. Lloyd was meant to be his best man. As the door closed, he knew he would never see his friend alive again. It was an act of survival that haunted him forever. The water swallowed the aft compartments, extinguishing the diesel engines and frying the batteries. Sparks flew, smoke rose, and the lights throughout the submarine flickered, then died, plunging the survivors into total darkness. The Squalus angled at 45 degrees, creaking as it dropped deeper into the Atlantic. Men clutched bulkheads, bracing for an implosion they believed inevitable. The submarine was rated for a maximum safe depth of 250 feet. No one knew how deep the ocean floor was beneath them. Electrician's mate Lawrence Gaynor grabbed a flashlight and forced his way into the battery spaces. He found smoldering cells sparking dangerously. If the heat reached critical levels, the batteries could explode, ripping open the hull. Half blinded by the flash, Gaynor pulled the disconnect switches in time, sacrificing his vision to save the vessel. Sparks burned across his face, leaving him partially blinded for life, but his courage prevented instant destruction. Finally, with a bone-shaking thud, the submarine struck the bottom. To their astonishment, they had landed upright, bow first, at 240 feet, barely 10 feet shy of their rated crush depth. Against all odds, the control room and forward compartments had remained watertight. 33 men were alive, but they were entombed in a steel coffin beneath hundreds of tons of seawater. What do you do when you are trapped in darkness, freezing, and running out of air with no guarantee anyone even knows where you are? The silent wait. The surviving men of the Squalus did not panic. Their training, drilled into them through endless exercises, took over.
The USS Squalus left 33 survivors trapped at the bottom of the ocean. It is history that deserves to be remembered.
They moved with grim discipline, conserving strength and oxygen. The first task was to signal the surface. A buoy equipped with a phone line was released, attached by cable to the submarine. It should have carried both communication and location. The men also prepared smoke markers and flares, desperate to give rescuers any chance of finding them. But the sea had other plans. The buoy line snapped during an ocean swell, silencing the phone. Hours later, when their sister ship USS Sculpin arrived to search, they saw no buoy, no smoke. The crew inside the Squalus could hear the thrum of propellers above them, tantalizingly close, yet they had no way to make contact. They tapped on pipes, listening for a reply from sailors in the flooded compartments. There was only silence. It confirmed what they already knew. Half their brothers were gone. Naquin ordered emergency supplies distributed, flashlights, carbon dioxide absorbents, and rations. He calculated that with 33 men in the sealed compartments, they had perhaps 48 hours of breathable air, less if panic set in. He divided the crew into 2 groups. 10 men were sent into the colder torpedo room to save oxygen, while 23 remained in the control room. Blankets were shared, coats passed around, and bodies huddled together for warmth as the temperature fell to near freezing. Ice began to form on the inner hull. To fight despair, some men hummed quietly. Others tried to sleep, though pounding headaches and nausea from rising carbon dioxide made rest difficult. They knew they might never see daylight again, yet none spoke of giving up. Their captain rationed oxygen carefully, venting it in intervals to stave off suffocation without exhausting reserves. It was a deadly calculation, but discipline held. The men of the Squalus clung to hope that the Navy would not abandon them. Above, their hope was justified. The USS Sculpin spotted a flare in the distance, then found the snapped buoy. Dragging grappling hooks across the seafloor, they rediscovered the submarine's location. Reinforcements were called, including a ship carrying an experimental device, the Submarine Rescue Chamber. It had never been used in a real emergency. The lives of 33 men now depended on an invention untested outside of drills. Could an unproven rescue capsule really save dozens of men trapped in the ocean's black depths, or would it become their final coffin? The rescue chamber arrives. By the afternoon of May 23rd, the Navy was mobilizing every resource it could. The Squalus had failed to surface, and the signals from her snapped buoy suggested a catastrophic accident. Time was now the enemy. Every passing hour meant less oxygen for the men trapped below. The call went out to the submarine tender USS Falcon, which happened to be in Connecticut, with a strange experimental device on board. The Submarine Rescue Chamber, often called the McCann Rescue Chamber, after one of its inventors, Commander Charles Swede Momsen. The chamber resembled an oversized metal diving bell. It was 9 tons of steel, with rubber gaskets around the base designed to form a seal against a submarine's hatch. Once attached, it could be pressurized, allowing trapped sailors to climb in and be hauled to the surface. It had never been tested in a real disaster. The Squalus would be its first trial by fire. When the Falcon arrived at the site early on May 24th, seas were calm, but the clock was merciless. Divers prepared for the descent, each one aware of the dangers. The submarine lay at 240 feet, so deep that nitrogen narcosis could disorient a diver within minutes. Breathing mixes that could reduce the risk were still experimental, so the Navy had to work with what they had. Divers would be limited to 20 minutes at a time, tethered to safety lines, groping their way down into black water colder than ice. One by one, divers descended. The pressure squeezed their suits, and the dark swallowed the last traces of sunlight. Their mission was to prepare the Squalus for the chamber's arrival, guiding the bell and securing its cables. At one point, a diver disoriented by narcosis slammed into the hull, nearly losing consciousness. Somehow, he regained his composure, attached the line, and carried on. Above, the men of the Falcon held their breath, watching bubbles surface, praying the divers would not become casualties themselves. Finally, the chamber began its first descent. 2 operators inside worked the controls as it slid slowly down the cable, swaying in the current. Hours ticked by. Below, in the Squalus, the survivors listened to the groaning of metal above them, praying it was the chamber and not some new failure in their hull. At last, a hollow thud echoed through the forward hatch as the chamber sealed itself against the submarine. Pumps roared, water drained, and for the first time since the accident, the hatch opened to the outside world. 2 rescuers appeared, bringing blankets, coffee, and the miracle of fresh hope. The sailors inside the Squalus could barely believe their eyes. They were not forgotten. Rescue had come. But how do you save 33 men when the rescue chamber can only carry 8 at a time? 1 trip at a time. Naquin knew hard choices lay ahead. The chamber could hold only 8 survivors per trip. At best, each round trip took 3.5 hours. An hour down, an hour to secure and load, and an hour and a half back to the surface. Even with perfect efficiency, it would take more than a full day to bring everyone out. The air inside the Squalus would not last that long. The solution was grim but necessary. Prioritize the weakest. Men who were wet, shivering, and close to hypothermia would go first. The younger and stronger would stay behind. Naquin himself insisted he would be last. Leadership, he believed, meant sharing every danger until the very end. The first group climbed into the chamber. As the hatch sealed, a sudden fear struck the men remaining. What if it failed on ascent? What if the chamber's cable snapped, or the gasket tore free? They would never know. Minutes after departure, silence filled the submarine again. The wait for return was almost worse than the disaster itself. Inside the chamber, the ride upward was surreal. The capsule swung and rocked, creaking against the pull of the cable. Darkness pressed in from all sides. The survivors huddled together, counting the minutes, until at last light filtered in through the porthole. The chamber broke the surface, and men from the Falcon cheered as the hatch opened. Exhausted sailors staggered into the daylight, greeted with hot coffee and medical care. For the first time in nearly 30 hours, they were breathing free air. Below, the waiting dragged on. Men tapped their feet, clenched fists, and forced themselves to sleep. Carbon dioxide, built in their lungs, bringing headaches, dizziness, and nausea. Naquin rationed emergency oxygen, releasing it in short bursts, then shutting it down to stretch their supply. The cold gnawed at them, temperatures dropping near freezing. Ice crystals formed along the hull, and hypothermia threatened to claim the weakest. Trip after trip, the chamber returned. Each time, it carried another group upward, another set of men torn from the jaws of the sea. After 3 successful ascents, only 10 men remained. They crowded together for warmth, whispering encouragement, knowing they were the last. Naquin, true to his word, prepared to board only when all others were safe. He climbed into the chamber with the final group. Relief surged until disaster struck. What happens when the rescue chamber itself fails, leaving the last survivors once again trapped beneath the ocean? A narrow escape. As the chamber ascended with the final group, it jolted violently at 150 feet. Inside, the men were thrown against the steel walls, clutching at rails as the capsule shuddered to a stop. A stabilizing cable had jammed, locking the chamber in place. Worse still, the main hoisting cable that connected them to the surface groaned under the strain. 7 strands of woven steel had already snapped, leaving only 2 to bear the entire 9-ton weight. If they gave way, the chamber and the last survivors of the Squalas would plummet back to the seafloor, smashing open against the wreck. On board the Falcon, panic rippled through the crew. Sailors crowded the rails, staring into the cold Atlantic where the chamber dangled unseen. Commanders barked orders, trying to keep discipline, but everyone understood what was at stake. Below them, 8 men hung suspended between life and death, their lives depending on 2 fraying strands of wire. Divers prepared to descend, though the depth would push them past the limits of safety. One man stepped forward without hesitation, volunteering for the most dangerous dive of his career. Weighted down by gear, he slid beneath the waves and vanished into the gloom. Every second was perilous. At 150 feet, nitrogen narcosis clouded the mind, making every action sluggish and confused. Yet he pressed on. Reaching the chamber, he felt his way across the steel until he located the jammed stabilizer. His knife sliced through the cable in one decisive stroke. Instantly, the chamber broke free, but now it spun like a pendulum in the current, twisting dangerously, as the last 2 strands of the hoist screamed in protest. Commanders on the surface faced an impossible choice. To continue with the winch risked snapping the weakened cable, but to abandon the chamber meant condemning 8 men to death. They chose the only path left. The chamber would be hauled by hand, 9 tons of steel, 150 feet of seawater, and the weight of 8 human lives resting on raw muscle and willpower. Sailors lined the deck, gripping ropes with blistered hands. Inch by inch, foot by foot, they hauled, sweat pouring, arms burning, palms torn and bleeding. For 4 hours, they strained, their shouts of effort mixing with the groans of rope and steel. On board the chamber, the men could feel the slow rise, every jerk a reminder that they were not yet safe. Claustrophobic air pressed in on them, thick with the smell of sweat and oil, but no one dared to breathe too fast. Finally, with a roar of relief, the chamber broke the surface. Men on deck surged forward, wrenching open the hatch as seawater poured off the steel. Out climbed the survivors, pale, shivering, and exhausted, but alive.
And in 1939, 33 survivors aboard the submarine USS Squalus were living that nightmare. The early days of the U.S. submarine fleet were particularly perilous.
Last to emerge was Commander Oliver Naquin. His face was hollow with fatigue, but his eyes burned with resolve. He had promised his men they would not be abandoned, and against every expectation, he had kept that vow. Every single man sealed in the control room had been saved. 33 sailors had endured nearly 40 hours entombed on the ocean floor, and 33 sailors walked free. It was a miracle of courage, training, and sheer human endurance. The men were safe, but the submarine remained. Could the Navy possibly raise the steel coffin still resting in silence at the bottom of the Atlantic? Raising the steel coffin. With the survivors safe, the Navy faced another dilemma. The USS Squalus was brand new, one of the most advanced submarines of her class, worth millions of dollars in Depression-era America. She lay at a depth shallow enough to make salvage conceivable, but deep enough that no one had ever tried to raise a vessel of her size from the ocean floor. Abandoning her would mean wasting cutting-edge technology and admitting defeat to the very reputation that submarines already carried, the coffin service. But risking men and machines in the attempt would test the Navy's ingenuity like never before. Orders came down all the same. The Squalus must be raised. The task fell to the Navy's most experienced divers, many of whom had been involved in the rescue effort itself. They knew the site well by now, but raising the submarine would require far more than attaching a rescue chamber. It would mean moving hundreds of tons of waterlogged steel through a hostile environment where every mistake could be fatal. At 240 feet, each descent pressed their bodies to the limit. Helium-oxygen breathing mixes were still experimental, and most men still relied on compressed air, making nitrogen narcosis a constant danger. Divers reported feeling dizzy, euphoric, or confused after only minutes on the bottom, and every task had to be planned with strict discipline. Visibility was often reduced to a murky arm's length. The frigid Atlantic gnawed through their suits, and even the simple act of maneuvering heavy cables beneath the hull became a life-threatening exercise. They rotated in short shifts, surfacing to decompress in stages to avoid the crippling agony of the bends. The plan was straightforward in theory, daunting in practice. Teams would run heavy steel cables beneath the Squalus, lashing pontoons, massive steel cylinders, to her sides. Once filled with compressed air, these pontoons would provide enough buoyancy to lift the submarine gradually to the surface. But the forces involved were immense. A single miscalculation in balance or air pressure could rip cables apart like string, send pontoons rocketing to the surface, or hurl the submarine upward uncontrollably. The first attempt nearly ended in disaster. As the divers inflated the pontoons, the submarine began to rise, but too fast. The careful balance of buoyancy gave way to uncontrolled force. With a groaning lurch, the Squalus shot free of her restraints and blasted toward daylight. Sailors on the surface shouted as her conning tower broke the waves, but the triumph lasted only seconds. The chains tore loose, and gravity reclaimed its prize. The submarine plunged back into the depths, slamming into the seabed with a force that shook her battered frame. The failure was crushing. For weeks, divers had risked their lives to prepare her, and in an instant, she had slipped back into the darkness. But the Navy did not give up. 4 more attempts followed, each one an ordeal of engineering trial and error. Pontoons were shifted, chains re-rigged, lift sequences recalculated. Each time divers descended, they fought exhaustion, cold, and the haunting sight of the submarine resting silently on the bottom, its hull scarred, its hatches sealed. They worked in near blindness, guiding steel under the belly of a submarine that seemed determined to remain in its watery grave. It was not just machinery being tested, but human resolve. Many of the divers knew the men whose bodies were still inside. They had heard their voices through steel only weeks before. Now they labored with the knowledge that every compartment they secured was both a tomb and a monument. Yet with each attempt, the Navy refined its technique. Slowly, through persistence and ingenuity, they learned how to control the ascent, balancing the pontoons like a fragile orchestra of steel and air. After 4 months of grueling effort, the ocean finally yielded its prize. With a steady groan, the Squalus began to rise, this time under control. Foot by foot, she ascended toward the surface. Onlookers cheered as her hull broke into daylight, battered but intact, and tugboats moved in to tow her to Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. Once inside dry dock, her compartments were drained. The Navy recovered 25 bodies of the men who had perished. One sailor's body was lost forever when a hatch unexpectedly burst open during salvage, drifting into the depths, claimed permanently by the sea. The rest were buried with honor, their funerals attended by grieving families and shipmates who had survived. For the Navy, the salvage was more than recovery. It was a demonstration that even the most hopeless wrecks could be retrieved. It was proof that submarines did not have to remain coffins on the ocean floor, and that every trapped crewman might yet be given a chance. The lessons learned from the Squalus would shape every submarine rescue and salvage operation for decades to come. But what became of the men who had lived through one of the Navy's darkest days? And what legacy did the Squalus leave behind? Legacy of the Squalus. The investigation into the disaster revealed what the crew had already suspected. The failure was not human. A mechanical malfunction had prevented an air vent from closing properly, despite the control board showing green. The fault had doomed the submarine in an instant, but it vindicated Naquin and his men. They had not erred. They had fought an impossible fight with discipline and courage. The Squalus herself did not vanish into history. Repaired and recommissioned, she was renamed USS Sailfish. When war came in 1941, she was back at sea, patrolling the Pacific against Japan. In a strange twist of fate, the Sailfish sank a Japanese destroyer that had earlier been involved in sinking her sister ship, the Sculpin. Some of the very survivors of the Squalus served aboard her, carrying their ghosts back into battle. For the men, life after the accident was complicated. Some returned to service, others never set foot on a submarine again. 4 of the survivors would die in combat during World War II. Oliver Naquin never commanded another submarine. He shifted into engineering roles and survived the attack on Pearl Harbor. He lived with the memory of the decision he had made that day, the order to seal the doors, sacrificing some to save others. His report to the Navy praised his men above himself, noting their willingness to share blankets, to huddle together against the cold, to give up what little comfort they had for comrades weaker than themselves. The electrician, Lawrence Gaynor, who had blinded himself by disconnecting the failing batteries, lived the rest of his life with vision problems. Yet, his act had saved the submarine from certain explosion. To Naquin, it was his courage that had preserved the chance for rescue. The rescue of the Squalus became part of official Navy training, written into manuals, studied by generations of submariners. The McCann Rescue Chamber proved its worth and led to a new doctrine. Every submarine accident could be answered with hope, not despair. Decades later, deep submergence rescue vehicles would evolve directly from that daring experiment in 1939. For the public, the story of the Squalus was a revelation. In a time when submarines were feared and mistrusted, the survival of 33 men through an ordeal of darkness, cold, and dwindling air was a triumph of human spirit.
By that buoy, which is a guide to the diver, he descends to work with the rescue chamber when it is lowered. Deep in the sea there, 33 men are alive, in danger of dying for lack of air.
Newspapers hailed it as proof that the coffin service had found a way to defy death. But perhaps the greatest legacy was not the submarine, nor the rescue chamber, but the enduring reminder that even in the deepest darkness, courage can carve a path back to light. The sinking of the USS Squalus was a disaster that could have ended in total tragedy. Instead, through training, courage, and the untested bravery of Navy rescuers, it became one of the most extraordinary survival stories in naval history. 33 men trapped beneath the sea for 40 hours returned alive, carried upward by a device many had doubted would ever work. The submarine was salvaged, renamed, and sent back to war, carrying the memory of the dead and the pride of the living. More than 80 years later, the story remains a testament to what discipline, sacrifice, and hope can achieve in the face of overwhelming odds. Do you think you could have endured the cold, darkness, and suffocating air at the bottom of the Atlantic? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more incredible stories from history.